Wow, we are live. Good evening or good day to everybody, wherever you're joining us from. You are once again welcome to the Kingdoms podcast. And today we are having a live session with a very, very important personality, all the way from Canada. Which of the provinces are you in Canada?
I'm in Ontario.
Ontario. Okay, so we'll give you like the UFC kind of introduction. Uh, no, you're not a fighter anyway, so uh,
Oh, I'm a,
live
I'm a
from
fighter in a
Ontario.
way, so you can give me
Oh
the.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Fighting out of Ontario, Canada. Introducing Ivy Anigbgu. Wow, you're welcome. You're welcome. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much. I'm doing great. Thank you.
Okay, so I think it's morning over there, but then for most of us, most of the listeners, we are either in the UK or in Nigeria, and it's evening. Would I say it's evening? It's 4 p.m. anyways, so afternoon or evening, whichever way you want to look at it. But interestingly, right, coming to the business of the day, it's about educating our audience, right, on the immigration, process for potential immigrants to Canada. So the first question on my list, right? Over time, during the course of this session, we'll be having questions from the audience. So if you're joining us, I see some people are joining us. Thank you for joining, and you can kindly drop your questions for our experts, Ivy and Bogu, to do justice to them. So, from me to you, the very first question would be what are the different immigration programs that are available for individuals to move to Canada?
So in terms of immigration programs, we will talk of permanent residents, and that would be the express entry system. I will just give a brief overview of what the express entry system entails. The express entry system has three different programs in it. The first one is the Federal Skilled Workers Program. The other one is Canadian Experience Class, and then the third one would be the Federal Trade Skilled Program. And so, mostly, Nigerians would fall under the Federal Skilled Workers Program because that program would assign points according to if you have foreign work experience. The other two programs that I mentioned would be mostly for people who already have Canadian work experience, or if they have a certificate or a qualification from a licensed profession in Canada. All right. So, and the work experience that they would claim in the Federal Skilled Trade Program, for example, has to be work experience post that qualification. So it makes sense to say only when you have work experience from Canada is when you can apply through the Canadian Experience class or the Federal Skilled Trade Program class. And so that just leaves one program, which is the Federal Skilled Workers Program. Now, the Express Entry System is a point based system that IRCC uses to classify or to allocate points to candidates in the pool. And is based on various factors like age, your work experience, your education, your whether or not you have a family member in Canada, which falls under adaptability factors, and your language proficiency. And so, based on those points that are allocated to a candidate in the poll, a draw is done every 2 weeks, every fortnight, and people that rank the highest in that pool are invited to apply for permanent residence. So creating an express entry profile is not applying for permanent residence. It's just to put you in that pool, allocate points, and then once the draw is done, um, if the candidate meets the score for that draw, they are invited to apply for permanent residence. So this is the permanent residence route, which we'll be talking more of as we go through this session. But then there's people who also come as students, and Canada has pathways for students to have the opportunity to work after they are done with their school, and the possibility of converting that temporary resident status to a permanent resident status while they're in Canada. We also have the work permit route. That route is a bit more, it has a bit more requirements than I think is known. It's known by foreign nationals, because it's not just enough to get a job. It has to be a particular type of job. Like the employer has to qualify for something called an LMIA before they can give a foreigner, someone who is in Nigeria, for example, they can give that person a work permit, right? So there's
What's the LMIA?
the LMIA is the Labor Market Impact Assessment. The LMIA is it's a process that is done to ensure that the employer in Canada has looked within Canada and has not been able to find that skill to hire, and that's why they want to hire a foreigner from outside or a foreign national from outside Canada. So it's almost like a justification process that the employer has to go through in order for them to hire a foreign national. And that's a process in itself they have to go through. The employer would have to pay 1,000 Canadian dollars when they're hiring or when they want to go through this LMIA process. And then if they go through it, they advertise the job for a period of a minimum of like 2 to 3 months. When they go through that process and they've not been able to hire a Canadian resident, that's the point where they are issued that LMIA document, and now they can give that LMIA document to whoever the foreign national is that is going to apply to that job to apply for their work permit. So it's a little there's different complexities in it. It's not straightforward like people think that you can just apply for a job and once the employer gives you the job, that's it. You need to have this LMIA document that the employer will give to you to add to your work permit application if you're coming from a country like Nigeria.
Interesting. So we keep hearing about the express entry system, being in the pool, getting out of the pool. So, but then how does it work, for potential immigrants, especially Nigerians?
Okay. The express entry system, like I explained earlier, is a federal system. The government, the IRCC, is a department of the government in charge of immigration. They created this system to be able to rank individuals using various factors. And these factors would be based upon the types of professionals that they are trying to attract, is how they rank the factors or the scores. And so what the process is like is if an individual or if a foreign national wants to apply to come to Canada as a permanent resident, the first step is they would create an express entry profile. Now, this in this express entry profile, when they create this profile, the 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 um, the profile or the metrics that has already been created in this profile will run to see if they qualify for at least one of the three programs that I mentioned earlier. For someone who is coming from Nigeria or outside Canada, they will most likely only qualify for one of those programs. And that program is called the Federal Skilled Workers Program. Now, this Federal Skilled Workers Program has its own grid system where it allocates points also based on age, based on language proficiency, based on education, based on work experience, based on whether or not you have a spouse who has taken a language proficiency test like yourself, based on whether you have Canadian work experience or education, you or your spouse, based off of if you have arranged employment, which has a very restrictive definition. Arranged employment is not just getting a job; it has a specific definition that needs to meet that needs to qualify to be called an arranged employment. and if you have a relation in Canada, which is your relation, a parent, a child, a grandchild, a sibling in has its own point grid system. And a foreign national has to score 67 out of the 100 points to be able to qualify for that program. And so if a foreign national has scored 67 over 100 and qualified for the Federal Skilled Workers Program, then they are eligible to be placed into the pool. And then once they are placed into the pool, there's a different ranking system that is called the comprehensive ranking system. That one now allocates points, more points based on different factors. The maximum score a foreign national can get for the comprehensive ranking system is 1,200 points. But for the Federal Skilled Workers Program, the maximum points that a candidate can score is 100 points. And so it's a little bit, there's a little complexity, but I hope it's understood how I've explained it. And so once you qualify for the Federal Skilled Workers Program, because you scored over 67 points, then you're placed in the pool where you're assigned a comprehensive ranking score. And then based on that score, IRCC does draws bi-weekly, every fortnightly, so every 2 weeks. IRCC would do a draw, and then they would allocate, for example, if they want to call 5,000 candidates from the pool, they would call 5,000 from starting from the highest score in the pool. So if the highest score in the pool is 900 and the lowest score that would give 5,000 candidates, if the lowest score is 450, 450 would be the minimum score you need to have to be able to be invited within that 5,000 range, right? So that's how it's calculated. And so if you fall into that category of the score that is called for that particular draw, you'll be sent an email inviting you to apply for permanent residence. It's at that point that you will need to gather all your documents, because initially when you create the express entry profile, you're only entering your information about your work, your education, your age, and all those other factors. Once you're invited to apply, that's the point where you have to present all those documents that you've claimed that you had. And remember that all those factors that you've claimed that you have was the basis of the score that you were assigned. So when you're
Oh,
invited to apply, if you've said in your express entry profile you have a master's degree, and then at the point where you need to submit your application for permanent residence, you don't have a master's degree, you actually have a bachelor's. That's there's a disconnect there, and that's called misrepresentation, because you've been allocated scores based off of you having a master's degree. The score for someone who has a master's degree, the points, is higher than someone who has a bachelor degree. And so if based on what you filled in your profile, you've been given 20 points, for example, because you have a master's degree, but what you actually have is a bachelor's, and if bachelor's point is 10 points, for example, that has dropped your point by 10. And if the threshold, the draw that was called was 450 points at that time, because you don't have a master's, your point is going to drop by 10 because you have a bachelor, meaning that you're falling out of that ranking, like out of the range to
out of
have
the
been
threshold.
invited. Exactly. So you shouldn't have been invited, right? And you don't want to do that. That's misrepresentation. And I will say misrepresentation throughout this session, because it's very important that people know that there's a 5-year ban for misrepresentation, whether or not you know about that error in your application. So it doesn't matter. There's a 5-year ban. And so once you're invited to apply for permanent residence, you have 60 days from the date you're invited to submit your complete application. And that's when you're also going to submit your proof of fund, the proof of funds that you have to be sufficient for you and your family for at least a period of 12 months. The proof of fund is defined already by IRCC. There's a table for it depending on your family size. And so that's just an overview of the
12
process.
months.
Yes, it's
that
it's
that
defined.
that's
Yeah, it's defined already, so you don't need to wonder what calculation it is. The table is on IRCC website.
Interesting. But then you're talking about the educational qualifications, right? So are there like institutions from which, let's say, a master's or a bachelor's degree would not be recognized? Like, what is how do they recognize these qualifications that people claim to have?
So Canada has evaluation agencies. They call them educational evaluation agencies that would evaluate your credential and give the equivalence of that credential to what it is in Canada. So, for
Okay.
example, and it's these institutions are the ones who would determine whether or not that foreign institution qualifies in the first place, and then decide whether or not that 4 year bachelor degree, for example, you obtained from Nigeria, can equate to a 4 year bachelor degree in Canada. And so this is part of the documents that you would need to have. If you did not obtain your education from Canada, you would need to submit your transcript to one of these evaluation bodies, and then they would go through your transcript, look at the courses that you did, and then look at the courses that is obtainable in Canada for that same um, um, program, and then they would rank you. They would say whether or not your 4 year diploma or your 4 year bachelor degree is equivalent to a 4 year bachelor degree or a 4 year diploma in Canada. So based on their assessment, you would take that document. If they've assessed and said 4 year bachelor from your school in your program is the same as a 4 year bachelor in Canada, that's good. Then you can submit that evaluation certificate as your proof to show that your education, you actually have the bachelor degree, right? So the those institutions are the ones who determine what types of foreign institution qualify for equivalence with Canadian education.
Interesting. So, how about like professional qualifications, for example? Persons like myself, being a chartered accountant, I understand that the last time I was talking with somebody about one of those evaluating organizations, I think West, right, is
Yeah,
one of them, right?
yeah.
So they were saying some professional qualifications don't get recognized, some others get recognized. So, like, what kind of points do professional qualifications get you, and which ones from Nigeria specifically, right, are being recognized currently?
So the professional qualifications, it depends on what profession you're in. Like someone who is in the medical field, for example, they have to get their license when they are in Canada, right? For someone who is a chartered accountant, for example, the professional qualification might be assessed and equated to probably a 3 years degree or so, but it depends on the institution. And there are very few of those institutions here in Canada that do the evaluation for professional degrees. And so if you wanted to check to see which ones would do the evaluation for your own profession, you would that's a research that you have to do to check to see which one would give you equivalence for your profession. Like pharmacists, for example, they have a different evaluation body that does Northwest that would do for someone who has a pharmacy degree, right? For someone who is a nurse, for example, where there's a different evaluation body that would do that for someone who is a nurse. So it depends on what your profession is, and then you can check to see which of these institution would evaluate that credential.
Okay. But then, how can Nigerians, right, improve their chances of success within the express entry system? So we've spoken about things like, educational um, degrees, right? But then, what other major criteria that can easily be worked on, which can be used to boost their chances of success?
So one ability that has always been there but didn't really have so much impact but now has an impact because express entry now has category based has now has a category based system, is French language ability or French language proficiency. So that's one skill that Nigerians can work on. And I will just explain briefly what the category based express entry is. So previously, the express entry system was based on the highest ranking candidates. People who fall under that category are people who have a provincial nomination certificate, for example, from a province, which will give them 600 points automatically. People who are younger, people who have a higher education, people who have a higher language proficiency score in English, for example, people who have more years of experience. This was how it was ranked previously. It was a person who had the highest points in the poll that would be called. But then recently, I think a year or so back, Canada, the IRCC decided to introduce a category based express entry system where they now focus on in-demand skills and occupation that the country needs, the economy needs. So the occupations currently there now, I think there are about six of them. You have healthcare, French language proficiency, trade occupations, transport occupations, STEM, which is science, tech, engineering, and math. And then you have agriculture. So six of them, six of these categories, if a candidate falls under either of these categories in terms of their profession or if they have French language ability, they now have a two-edged sword. Like they have two options. They still are under the regular express entry pool, but then they have this added skill whereby the points for that particular skill is most likely less than what the general express entry score would be in terms of when there's a draw, right? So, for example, I think it was last month, the French people who have French language skills were invited to apply, and the score was about I think 380 something, 388 or so were
Oh, wow,
invited to
as
apply.
opposed to like 450.
Yeah, so as opposed to the general, which was called last 2 weeks, and the score was 549, right?
Wow.
So if you're in the
The
pool.
defense is really
Exactly.
right.
So if you're in the pool and you have French ability and your score is 400, for example, you didn't have a chance of being called under the general pool, but you were going to be called under the French category, right? So French language proficiency is one skill that I think Nigerians can get because where English is our legal franca in Nigeria. We don't speak French, right? Yeah, but that's a pathway that people can try to explore. And I know that there might be different resources in Nigeria or even online now that people can access to be able to learn French. All you need to do is just score a CLB 7 in French. And once you do that, you qualify under that category. And then there are even other provinces also that have programs just for French speakers. And for those of us that don't know, Canada is a bilingual country, is French and English. And so the country we're more English speakers, of course, in Canada, but they are looking for ways to increase the French population in Canada. So that's something that they've been focusing on the provincial level, but now the federal government has also taken it into consideration. So if there's anything you want to change, maybe look at the French learning French and take a sitting for the exam.
Oh, wow. Learning French. Je suis étudiant. Je parle, je parle français.
Yeah,
Wow. I don't know so much in French, but I think I should start taking French more seriously, given the
yeah.
power of French. If you dialed in, if you joined in, you can start, typing your questions in. Wow. So, are there like specific provincial nominee programs that are well suited for Nigerians?
Yeah, so there are only a few. that Nigerians can apply for if they're outside Canada. Most of the provincial nomination programs, you already have to have a job offer, or you already need to have been living in that province, or you already need to have schooled in that province. There are very few of them that you can apply from outside Canada. Ontario has express entry for people from outside Canada. Manitoba is another one that would have that you can apply from outside Canada. And with the Manitoba one, if you have a relative or a friend, they are able to sponsor you. They are able to write a letter of support to say they will take care of you when you come into Manitoba. And so that's something you can use for the provincial nomination. Saskatchewan is another province that allows foreigners, people who have not been to Canada, to apply to their province. There are just very few of them. Northwest Territories also have that possibility. And then PEI is Prince Edward Island. These programs change constantly. And so even whenever it is you're listening to this video, or if you're on this call, you want to make sure that you've checked to see if these programs are still available for foreign nationals before you go ahead to submit any application or start your application process, because it changes very frequently.
Interesting. So, how about with family sponsorship? Are Nigerians and other immigrants able to um, migrate to Canada by way of family sponsorship?
Yeah, let me just go back to the provincial nomination. I wanted to mention also what the provincial nomination program is. Each province, Canada has 12 provinces, and each province have their own provincial nomination program. But these individual provinces all flow into the federal express entry system. And so to be able to apply to a province, you have to have qualified for at least one of the federal express entry programs, which I mentioned is the FSWP, the Federal Skilled Workers Program. You have to have scored 67 over 100 to be able to apply to these provinces. So even if you meet the requirement of these individual provinces, if you don't meet the requirement of scoring 67 over 100 for the Federal Skilled Workers Program, you cannot apply to these provinces, right? So the provincial nomination is a process where the province would issue a certificate of nomination to a foreign national, or someone who has studied or worked in their province, and that certificate of nomination can now be added to the candidate's express entry profile. That certificate of nomination gives the candidate 600 points. So if, for example, the candidate was in the pool and they have 250 points, by getting a provincial nomination certificate, they now have 850 points, which means that if I said last 2 weeks the score was 549 for general category for the draw, if someone has 850, automatically they will be invited to apply. That's why you see a number of people go through the provincial nomination process. But then, like I said, you have to first of all meet 67 over 100 for the Federal Skilled Workers Program to even be able to apply to a province.
Oh, interesting. So, for example, I know some people have some sort of family sponsorship, right? Say if an immediate family member, let's say your brother or your parent or something, is in Canada, and what's the process like for them inviting you into the system?
Okay, so the definition of family members, qualifying family members, is actually restrictive. And I
Okay.
also think that's another of the misconceptions that we have. What the category of people that qualify as a family member under the definition of for family sponsorship would be a parent, a grandparent, a dependent child, an adopted child, and a spouse or a common law partner or a conjugal partner, right? Those are the only categories of people that can be sponsored through the family sponsorship program. Just this category 5, I think I mentioned. So your spouse,
Of
your
parents? Spouse.
Yeah, parent, grandparent, spouse, dependent child, or adopted child. That's it, right? If you have any of these family members, and then there's a condition also for the sponsor. The person who is already resident in Canada has to be a permanent resident, and they have to be a citizen. Someone who is on a temporary resident visa, for example, a student or a worker cannot sponsor, does not fall under the family sponsorship class. They cannot sponsor their family members. The only people who can sponsor have to be permanent residents of Canada or citizens of Canada. And then they have to be over the age of 18. They have to have sufficient funds to be able to sponsor these people. And they would also sign an undertaking to say that for a period of time, I'm going to care for this person. So if that person that is sponsored comes to Canada, they cannot file for any kind of social assistance from the government within a certain period. For spouse and dependent child, that the number of years is 3 years. For parents, the number of years is 20 years, right? So for that period of time, the people you have sponsored cannot file for social assistance, or you would have to pay that money back to the government. And so the process for the sponsorship would be the sponsor in Canada, who is a PR or a citizen, would submit an application for sponsorship, and the application can be submitted at the same time. So the sponsor submits an application to sponsor their dependent child or their spouse, and then at the same time, a permanent residence application is submitted for the people who they want to sponsor, right? And so based on that, the application can be submitted on one. If they go through that process, then they are able to sponsor if everything checks and all is good. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out here is for those foreign nationals that are still outside Canada, like in Nigeria, for example, that are looking to apply for permanent residence, they are just starting for this process. Please declare all your family members. Declare your everybody, even your siblings. Declare everybody in your application. Your dependent children, whether or not you have custody of those dependent children, you should be declaring them. Your spouse, you need to declare your spouse. You need to declare your siblings, you need to declare your parents. Make sure you declare, because if you don't declare, later on down the line, if when you become a permanent resident or a citizen, if you try to sponsor them, that will create an issue. And the reason is because when you declare people on your application, whether or not they are coming with you to Canada, those who are your immediate dependents, your spouse and your dependent children, they would have to go through assessment. So your dependent children under the age of 18 would go through medicals. They will have to take medical exam, whether or not they are coming with you to Canada. Your spouse would have to do a medical exam and a police certificate. If you have children over the age of 18, they also have to do a police certificate. Now, based on that, if you're coming through express entry, of course, you have to provide proof of fund. Now, the number of people on that proof of fund will be dependent on the number of people you have as your spouse and your dependent. So if you've not declared them as your spouse or dependent, and now you've come to Canada, you become a PR, or you've even gotten your citizenship, and at that point you want to sponsor them, that becomes an issue. And that can even impact you also, because that's misrepresentation. That means you had these family members, you did not declare them at that time, probably because you didn't want them to impact your proof of fund. And now you're saying you want to invite them to Canada. So please make sure when you're filling your application for permanent residence, you're mentioning everybody who is your spouse, who is your dependent child, who is your sibling, who is your parent, so that down the line, if you decide that you want to sponsor any of them, you're able to sponsor them. Yeah, so this is the family sponsorship program. Is for people who are already here in Canada that have PR or have Canadian citizenship.
Interesting. Just on a lighter note, can I declare my village people? If you say
You can't declare, you can't declare your village people. You can't declare your
declare
village people. No, there's no way.
every family member, but it seems quite, I don't have a word for it, but uncomfortable that I can't sponsor my sibling, right? A sibling
Yeah.
doesn't seem to fall under the definition of uh, family member when it
Yeah.
comes to the sponsorship, but it is what it is. So thank you to everyone who's currently listening, who's with us live. Kindly drop your questions if you have for our experts in the virtual studio. So, the next question relates to students, right? So, what are the requirements for foreign students who want to study in Canada?
Okay, sorry again. Before I go to the students, for the family sponsorship, you mentioned siblings. There's a an exception for siblings who are orphaned and who are below the age of 18. So if
Oh,
there's a sibling that doesn't have, like, the parents are no longer alive, they are called orphaned siblings, and they are below the age of 18, you're able to sponsor them, right? So that's the exception. There are some exception in that regard. And for the purpose of immigration in Canada, the age of a dependent is 22 and below is the age of a dependent. So if you can, someone is only a dependent child if they are 22 and below. If you have a child who is 22 and over, they are no longer dependent children. And so you cannot sponsor them as part of your application. They would have to apply for themselves because they are no longer dependent. They will have to do a separate permanent residence application, or you would have to come to Canada as a PR and then sponsor them to join you. That's how it works.
interesting.
Okay, so then let me go into the students. The requirement for students from Nigeria. If a student wants to apply to a school in Canada, they can apply to the school and submit their letter of interest that explains why they are applying to that course. If the school grants them that admission, they'll be issued a letter of acceptance. The abbreviation is an LOA for the purpose of this session. So they'll be issued an LOA. That LOA will state the resumption date. It will state the deposits that they need to pay to secure their space before they resume. And so once they get that at LOA, they are able to apply for a study permit to the Canadian government. When they are applying to IRCC for a study permit, they will need to include their LOA. They will need to include a copy of the receipt for the deposit that has been made. They will also need to include a statement of interest that is an addition to the letter, the statement of interest they had previously written to the school for the admission. And let me just explain that. The statement of interest that was written to the school for the admission explained why the student wants to take that course and explain what their prior experience has been in terms of education and work, and their why, what they want to use that course for, like in terms of their career path. That's the statement of interest to the school. Now, the statement of interest to IRCC for the study permit there has to be an addition to that statement of interest that was submitted to the school. And the addition would be explaining the intention to depart Canada once they are done with their studies. So the temporary resident visa would assign the temporary resident visa is given to a foreign national. If the foreign national is able to prove that once they are done with their visit or their study or their work, they would be going back to their country of residence. And so there has to be an intention to depart, is very key. And so, how can you show your intention to depart? If you have a property in Nigeria, like a land, or if you have a house, or if you have aged parents that you take care of in Nigeria, or if you're not coming with your spouse or your dependent children in Nigeria, those are proof that you can use to show that you intend to depart. If you still have your job and maybe you just took some time off work to be able to come to school in Canada, that's something else that you can use to prove. If you're part of an organization, for example, like a volunteer organization, you're a key member in that organization, that's another thing that you can prove to show that you would go back to Canada after your studies, after you're done with your studies. Okay, so this explanation needs to be added to the statement of interest that was submitted to the school for the admission. And then you also have to submit a proof that you have living expenses to cover your cost of living in Canada. The cost of living was recently updated for students. on January 1st this year, 2024, it was updated to about $20,000 for students. And so if there's any spouse or any dependent that is coming with them, there's an additional amount that needs to be shown. Okay, so your proof of funds can be a bank statement that you have for 6 months, that you have to show that amount. And if you ever have a lump sum amount that just came into that account, you must be able to prove what that amount is. Maybe that amount came from a contract, for example, that you did. You should be able to provide those contract documents. So the basis of the success of an application is mostly the type of supporting documents that can be provided to show that you have an intention to depart, you're able to take care of yourself and your family if you're coming with your family members to Canada, and you won't be a burden to the government of Canada. Once you're able to provide those information and those supporting documents, you submit it for your study application. Your study application most likely be out. The timeline now is 13 weeks, but 13 weeks or less. Sometimes it comes out earlier, right? So that's the timeline. That's the process. And then once you're given your study visa, you come to Canada. And let me just stay on point for some time also, because there were new changes that also came in this year, 2024, for the type of program that a student engages in. Previously, before 2023 and back, if a student comes to Canada for a 1 year postgraduate diploma, for example, or they come into Canada for a 1 year master program, after they finish that program, if that program is eligible for a postgraduate work permit, they will be given a postgraduate work permit for the duration of that course. So if they did a postgraduate diploma for 1 year, they'll be given, if they did a postgraduate diploma for 1 year, they'll be given a postgraduate work permit for 1 year. If they did a master's program for 1 year, they'll be given a postgraduate work permit for 1 year. But remember, that course has to be PGWP eligible. It has to be postgraduate work permit eligible. Not all programs in Canada are postgraduate work permit eligible. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that intending students have to also look out to make sure that the school they're applying to is a designated learning institution. The abbreviation for that is a DLI, right? A DLI is the only type of school that can be where the IRCC can give a study permit for. If a student applies to a non-DLI school, they might not be able to get a study permit for that. So when applying, you want to look out for a DLI that and a program that is PGWP eligible, right? When applying, so that after the program you can get a postgraduate work permit. Now, this year, 2024, it was changed whereby someone who has a postgraduate diploma that does that diploma for at least 8 months, they would get a postgraduate work permit for that period. So in that regard, there was no change. But somebody who is doing a master program or a PhD program, and even if the master program is 1 year, they would get a postgraduate work permit for 3 years. That was the change that happened. And then for spousal open work permit, which is a work permit that will be given to a student who intends to come with their spouse to Canada, that's a work permit that is LMIA exempt. It's LMIA exempt. You don't need to get an LMIA for that, for the spousal open work permit. That spousal open work permit previously was open to any type of program where the student is in the PGWP eligible program. Their spouse will be able to get the spousal open work permit. But the changes that came in this year is that only people who are in a master program or a PhD program, only these people are the ones who can bring their spouse, and their spouse will get a spousal open work permit. So that was a
Wow.
major change that came in this year. Anybody
So
who is doing
bachelor's degrees
yeah, anybody
and
who is doing
master.
a anybody who is in a bachelor, anybody who is doing a postgraduate certificate course or a postgraduate diploma can no longer bring their spouse to get a spousal open work permit.
Wow. Interested. So most foreign immigrants come in by way of either work or study, right? So my next question is typically what is the length of time, like how long does the immigration process typically take? So you can break that down between both the work pathways and study pathways.
Okay, so I mentioned the one for study permits is typically 13 weeks or less. And I wanted to mention that Canada has visa application centers all over the world, and so it's also dependent on where the candidates or the applicants' application lands, right? Which visa application center. Some might be faster than others, right? But typically, a student permit would be 13 weeks or less. A spousal open work permit will be between 6 months or less for a spousal open work permit. The LMIA process or LMIA, that one is for the employer, but the work permit that falls under that category will also be the same length of time, 4 to 6 months, as a spousal open work permit. The express entry is towing that part also is about 4 to 6 months, but also it depends on like I've seen 1 month for express entry application, right? So it depends on which visa application center the application lands. Now, when you start to talk of sponsorships, those are longer um, periods of time. Like spousal sponsorship will be about 12 months around that time. Parental sponsorship might be more, probably 1 to 2 years. So it depends on which type of application that is done and which visa center that application lands.
Okay. So, are there any specific language or requirements for foreign immigrants, Nigerians, more specifically, that are applying for to work or study in Canada?
Yeah, so the language requirement, if you're applying through for PR through the express entry, would be you having English proficiency. If you also have French proficiency, is an advantage because you would get added points for having a second language, and that second language would be French. So for us from Nigeria, um, our language is English, and so you'll be required to write IELTS, um, i- um, t- general tests to be able to um, apply to express entry. Now, for study permits or even work permit, it depends on the job that you're doing for work permit. It depends on the type of job. Some jobs may require to prove your language, but mostly it's not very common. But for the study permit or for the study admission, you would need to show that you can speak English. Even though we speak English, we still need to show that we can speak English. But that IELTS that will be written for the study is different from the one for APR. The one for the study would be IELTS academic. The one for the PR application is IELTS general, and your language proficiency test lasts for a period of 2 years from the date that the test was taken or the date that you get your result. So if you have it for 2 years, it's still valid. You can make use of it, right? So that's what it is. I wanted to go back to the family sponsorship for parents and grandparents. That one is slightly different from the sponsorship of a person's spouse or dependents. For the parents and grandparents sponsorship, it's like a lottery type system where you would have to submit an application and go into a pool, almost like the express entry pool, and then you'll be selected and invited to apply for your parents or grandparents. That's how the parents or grandparents process works. The one for the spouse and dependent is straightforward application where the sponsor will submit the application plus the PR application for their dependent or their spouse, straightforward application. But parents and grandparents is different.
Okay. So I'm beginning to see some questions from our audience. Uh, okay, the first one is about elderly people who want to visit Canada. So not for work and either a school visa process. So what are the options for elderly people who would like to visit Canada, uh, neither for work or for studies?
Yeah, so that would be a tourist visa, if I'm understanding the question correctly. So they just want to visit Canada. That would be a visitor visa. They can apply for a visitor visa. There's a maximum length of 6 months. if the officer at the point of entry does not specify the number of days or months that a person can stay. Typically is 6 months that a person can stay. So someone who is a senior, as we call them here, someone who is a senior
Senior
can
citizen.
apply. Yeah, we call them
What's
seniors.
the threshold? What's the threshold for seniors to be categorized as a
I
senior?
think it depends on what you're looking at. Like if you're looking at the pension plans, it's 65 years old. If you're looking at some other types of support, it's from 60 years old. So it depends on what you're looking at. But basically, I'll put it at 60, 65 is a senior. Like seniors will get discount for bus pass, for example, or maybe they don't pay for buses. Those kind of perks and benefits, you might be getting it from the age of maybe 55. So it depends on what type of program you're looking at. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
Oh
55
wow.
and up, I would say is already a senior. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
So
So
yeah, so the seniors can apply for visitor visa to come to Canada if they have a child that is already living here in Canada or even a grandchild, and that person is over 18 years old and that person is a PR or a citizen, they can actually apply for something called a super visa. A super visa would give them the opportunity to stay in Canada for 5 years straight in a 10-year period, right? So previously it was 2 years within a 5 year period, but it was changed. I think it was last year it was changed to 5 years straight in a 10-year period, a super visa. But a super visa would typically take probably 1 to 2 years also to process. But still it depends on where the application lands, right? But that's an option that people explore if they want their parents to stay or their grandparents to stay with them longer. So that's also an option for a senior.
interesting. I think we have another question asking what is the minimum score for the IELTS
Okay.
for the
Yeah.
Canadian visa.
Yeah, so it depends on the program that you qualify for. If you're someone who is coming from Nigeria, you have to score. If you're someone who is coming from Nigeria, like I said, you would qualify for the Federal Skilled Workers Program. The Federal Skilled Workers Program requires that you have a minimum of CLB 7. CLB is a Canada language benchmark. That's the full meaning of CLB. You have to score CLB 7 in all of the four areas: speaking, listening, writing, and reading. CLB 7. Now, CLB 7 has IELTS is translated into CLB 7, right? So maybe for speaking for CLB 7, for IELTS, that might be 6.5 or 6, right? For listening for CLB 7, the equivalent in IELTS might be 6.5 also, or 6. For writing for CLB 7, the equivalence in IELTS might be a 5.5. So there's an equivalence score to convert it, but the aim is to get CLB 7, and that chart is provided on IRCC website. You can see what the equivalent is, what the IELTS equivalent score is to CLB. But what I will always advise my clients is if you're writing IELTS, you want to aim to score at least an 8 in speaking, an 8 in listening, and then for reading and writing, you can score a 7, right? So it will be 8877 because that's going to give you almost the maximum point of CLB 9 or CLB 10. So even if the minimum score to qualify for the FSW program is CLB 7, you want to aim for higher because the higher your language score, the higher your point. And listening and speaking gives you higher points than reading and writing. And if you think about it, it makes sense that is that way. Because when you're speaking to someone, they want to be sure that you're able to express yourself. And when you're being spoken to, they want to be sure that you understand what is being said. So higher points are assigned for listening and speaking. So if you can focus on listening and speaking and get an 8.8 in your IELTS test, if your score is 7.7 in reading and writing, it's still okay. You still meet the requirement or the threshold of your CLB 7.
Wow, interesting. I think while we're talking about the speaking and writing, that prompted me to think, how about for persons with disabilities such as maybe being deaf or being is it dumb now? Yeah. So if you have speech impediment or hearing difficulties, so are there like exceptions for persons like that in terms of the language assessment?
So that's another area that we're diving into now because there's something that is called medical inadmissibility. Medical inadmissibility would be for some conditions that the Canada government considers as a condition that will cause excessive demand on public funds in Canada. And so there's some form of challenges or medical conditions that people would have, and they will fall into that category. Like, what does it take for the Canadian government to manage that kind of medical condition? Are they willing to manage that? So it's that's a different area in itself. The allowance to be able to do those, like I explained to you, you have to do listening and speaking, right? So for someone who is not able to hear, for example, someone who is deaf, and they are not able to listen, there's no exception for that in terms of the test, right? But there are other programs that people use to overcome those kind of challenges. There's a program that is called Humanitarian and Compassionate Program. That program is very, very tough to get through because there's so many things that needs to be proved to get through that program, right? So that's a different aspect in itself. But to answer your question, for these programs that I just mentioned now, the language proficiency needs to be provided, and listening, speaking is one of them.
Oh wow, interesting. So on my own list of questions, right? So I have just two questions left. So we have, can Nigerians apply for the permanent residency in Canada whilst they're residing in Canada?
Yeah.
So rather, whilst they're residing in Nigeria, rather, we spoke about residing in Canada, but for those residents in Nigeria, what's the option for them?
Yeah, so somebody residing in Nigeria or outside Canada can apply for permanent residence. What they need to do is create an express entry profile, put in the information that they have currently, and then gather the information that they don't have. Like they wouldn't have a language proficiency test, the IELTS. So you want to register for an IELTS general test as soon as you can, because you need to put the score from your test results in your express entry profile in order for it to grade you and rank you and assign a score to you. And then the other thing you want to do is also get your ECA. ECA is the one we talked about, the educational credential assessment. You want to get it from WES or any other of those evaluation bodies. You want to get that credential evaluated, because what the evaluation says, what the evaluation has assigned as the equivalence to Canada is what you're going to claim. So if your 4 year degree, bachelor degree in Nigeria has been evaluated as a 2 year diploma in Canada, what you're going to put on your profile is that you have a 2 year diploma, not a 4 year degree, not a 4 year bachelor, right? That's what it is. So I've seen situations where people have a 1 year diploma or a 2 year diploma from Nigeria, and it was from a professional body, and it was evaluated as a 3 or 4 year bachelor degree in Canada,
Wow,
right?
that's an
Yes,
advantage then.
exactly.
But how about
So it,
cases where the 4 year degree is now evaluated as a 2 year degree?
well, it depends on the type of courses that you take, right? So that's why you submit your
That would be
transcript.
quite
They review
painful.
the courses. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get back to the live questions. Someone is asking, how can one extend a postgraduate work permit after expiration?
Okay, so a postgraduate work permit cannot be extended. There's no option for it to be extended. It's a temporary permit that was granted. If somebody has a postgraduate work permit, let me backtrack. A postgraduate work permit can be applied for within 180 days of graduating from the program, from the study program. Once that postgraduate work permit is applied for and given, it starts to read. So if you've done a 1 year diploma, for example, your 1 year postgraduate work permit starts to read once you get your postgraduate permit. And once it expires, you don't have any option to extend it. It doesn't have any extension. There was a temporary policy, I think it was 2 years back, because of COVID, where it was allowed for people who had postgraduate work permit to extend. But that temporary policy now is, I think, it's done this April, or it already concluded. So you don't have any option to extend your postgraduate work permit. The only option for you to do is to apply for PR through express entry. And that's why I always encourage clients, when you're considering where to go to school, you have to you have to project what your end goal is. If your end
Okay.
goal is that you want to become a permanent resident after you're done with school, you might eliminate some provinces and look at some other provinces that would provide you a nomination certificate if you've schooled in their province. So, for
Okay.
example, Ontario has a master's um, provincial nomination program where if you've gotten your master's from Ontario, you can apply to the Ontario government even if you don't have a job offer, right? There are some provinces like that. New Brunswick also has those kind of programs for people who have graduated from their province. You can apply to get a provincial nomination certificate just based on your study that you studied in that province, right? So you have to be very strategic. If the purpose of your coming to Canada to study is because you want to convert your TRV to a PR in the end to become a permanent resident, then you have to be looking at the type of provinces that you're going into. The other consideration you want to think about if you're coming as a student is which provinces have free healthcare for international students, for example. Because if you don't have free healthcare, you're paying out of pocket, or you have a private insurance. Some schools will give you insurance. I think it's part of the fees. Some others don't, and you have to get a private insurance. And trust me, healthcare is very expensive in Canada. So there's some of all these considerations that you have to give, and that's why it's advisable, if you're not sure where to turn, because this information is a lot. You can consult us. We're here to serve you, and we can do all those checks for you, give you the best advice, projecting what you want in the end, what your end goal is, right? And then once we see what your end goal is, we can backtrack to say, okay, this is where you start from, and then this is how you need to go to get to where you want to be.
Interesting. So that actually leads me to the last question from me to you. So, where can Nigerians find more information and assistance regarding immigration to Canada?
Okay. So the Canadian government has been very generous and they've provided many of this information online. You can find it on IRCC website. If you just Google what you're looking for, you can find that information there. Um, if you're not sure where to turn because you're overwhelmed and the information is a lot, you can turn to us. We're here to serve you. We provide professional immigration advice that serves you and your family, and we want to work with you on that journey. And also keep in mind that if you read some of the IRCC website, you will always see a disclaimer at the top to say that this information is not the law. If you want to read the law is the Immigration Act or the immigration regulation, right? So that's where professionals come in, because what you have on the website is not necessarily the full legal information that you need to have. If you have a very simple immigration situation and it's just straightforward application, fine and good, you can go by that. If you have a more complex case, or even you're not sure where to turn, we as immigration consultant professionals, we look at the law, we go through the act and the legislation and the regulations and case laws to see how it applies to your particular situation. And I just wanted to also point out that people's situations are not the same. Like no two people can be the same. So if you look at someone who has done the process and maybe probably it was a seamless process for them, if your situation is different, it's not exactly what it was for that person. It's not you're not able to weigh the two to say, okay, this is I can do it if they've done it, because your situation is different, right? And I also wanted to mention that if you want to do this application yourself, you're able to do it yourself. You just need to make sure that all the information that you have is correct. You also need to make sure that you've declared everybody that is your family member that you need to declare. And most importantly, you have to be as truthful, you have to be very truthful. I was going to say as truthful as possible, but it's not as truthful as possible. You have to be very truthful and honest with exactly what your situation is. Because if you're not truthful and it's found out, there's a 5-year ban. The express entry system, the way it's designed, is if a an applicant turns a new age, the points drop by 5. And so someone who was given a ban for misrepresentation for 5 years, by the time they get to the 6th year, when they can now create an express entry profile and start all over from the beginning, their points will already have dropped by 25, because they've already lost 5 points for each year they turned a new age, right? So you want to make sure you're as truthful as possible. If you have anybody who is doing your application for you, please make sure to review the application before it's submitted. Like I said, ignorance is not an excuse under the law. Whether or not it's an intentional mistake or an unintentional mistake, it really doesn't matter. The mistake is the mistake. So if you have someone who is doing it for you, make sure to review that application before they submit the application for you. Okay.
Interesting. I think we have more questions from our audience. So the next person is asking, when a student gets a job after graduating, how long does it take to get a PR?
Okay, so if a student has schooled or done a program that is postgraduate work permit eligible, they would have gotten a postgraduate work permit after they finish their studies. They can apply for it. The other strategy is, if a student has 90 days from the day they graduate or the day they get their results, 90 days on their study permit. If a student applies for their postgraduate work permit, immediately they are done with their school, that postgraduate work permit starts counting. But there's already an allowance for 90 days in that period, right? So you want to apply as close to the end of that 90 days as possible, as long as your study permit is still active. And so once you apply for your postgraduate work permit, even if it's not yet out, you can start to work, right? And then once your postgraduate work permit is out, you have that period of time that you're working. Depending on how many years that you schooled, if you had schooled for 2 years under the previous process, if you had schooled for 2 years to get a postgraduate diploma, you would be getting a 2-year postgraduate work permit. If you have 2 years of Canadian work experience, if you have 1 year of Canadian work experience, you will qualify under the Canadian experience class. But keep in mind that any any work experience that was gotten when you were a student does not qualify. It doesn't count as work experience under Canadian experience class, but it would count as a work experience under the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So you might end up qualifying for two programs and having different lengths of experiences that qualify, if that makes sense, right? So you getting PR after you've worked as a student is dependent on, number one, which province you are in. Because if you're in a province that would give you a nomination certificate after your program with them, after your study program with them, then you can get 600 points from that, right? And once you get your 600 points from the nomination certificate, you can add that nomination certificate to your profile in the pool, and you stand a very good chance of getting invited to apply, right? If you're not in a province where you can get a provincial nomination certificate from school, maybe you can get a provincial nomination certificate if you get a job offer. So there are some provinces that if you're in tech and you get a job offer, you can apply to them for their nomination certificate. If you are in healthcare, you can apply to them for their provincial certificate, nomination certificate. So it depends on which province you find yourself. The province you find yourself is very, very key. You have to be very strategic, right? Before you delve into or decide which province you want to find yourself. And so if you're in the pool, um, and you qualify for Canadian experience class, because Canadian experience class, you only need to have 12 years of non-continuous work experience in the last 3 years from Canada to be able to qualify for that particular program, right? So if you have 12 years of 12 months of work experience in the last 3 years, you qualify for that program, and you would also qualify for the federal skilled workers program if you have 67 over 100 points, right? So there's just different combinations of what you need to do. But of course, if you're finding it challenging, please feel free to reach out and we can have a consultation about it.
Interesting. Speaking of reaching out, I am displaying the contact details for Anibef Immigration. That's the website right there, the phone number, and of course, Anibef Immigration on LinkedIn. So the very next question that I have from a member of our audience is this. It says, okay, I'm watching live now. I've got this question. While visiting Canada, under the visitor's visa, are you allowed to apply for work permits or PR? And how do you go about it if you intend to stay longer? I guess this is a two-in-one question. He
Yes.
says, yeah, while visiting Canada under the visitor's visa, are you allowed to apply for work permits or PR? And how do you go about it if you intend to stay longer?
Yeah, I get the question. So that's yeah.
It's a popular question.
I was
Yes.
hoping I was I was actually hoping you were going to ask me about misconceptions about Canadian immigration, but this is one of those. So it was, I think it was post COVID, because they had put a pause on the PR process, of course, because there was no movement in the world. There was a lack of uh, professionals, and then there was a lot of in-demand occupations that came up as a result of people not coming into the country through PR. And so the IRCC turned to people who were already residents in the country, regardless of their status. So if you were a visitor, you could, if you got a job, you could convert that visitor visa to a work permit. This is a temporary policy. It was supposed to expire, I think, last year, but it was extended, I think, to the end of this year. Where if you come as a visitor, you're able to change your work permit, your visitor visa to a work permit. Now, the catch here is the job that you're going to get has to be an LMIA supported job. The LMIA is a labor market impact assessment. The employer needs to have gotten a labor market impact assessment from ESDC, to be able to support that work permit that you're going to apply for, right? So if you come as a visitor, you have a maximum of 6 months to stay. If it wasn't specified by the visa officer or the border officer that stamped your visa when you came into Canada, if it wasn't specified a period for you to stay, like 2 months, then you can stay for up to 6 months. Now you have a 6 months period to stay. You have a visitor visa. Within that 6 months, you have to try to find an LMIA supported job. If you're able to get an LMIA supported job, then you can apply for your work permit to get an employer specific work permit. That work permit is called a closed work permit because you can only work for that particular employer. That employer will be named on your work permit as the employer that you work for, right? So that's the work side. Now for the PR, if you're coming here as a visitor, if you've already created your profile from outside Canada, or if you want to create your profile, your express entry profile, I mean, while you're in Canada, you can do that. But you being in Canada as a visitor doesn't give you any additional points. Most likely, what would help support you getting a PR is you having a job. So if you get an LMIA supported job, you might be able to apply to the province where you are for provincial nomination, for them to nominate you and give you a nomination certificate. If they nominate you and give you a nomination certificate, you have 600 points that you can now add to your profile, and you will stand a very good chance of getting called whenever they do the general draws, right? So, is there a possibility of applying or changing your visitor visa to work permit, or for you to apply for PR when you're in Canada? Yes, it's possible. But the key there is you have to get an LMIA supported job.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have two questions left. The first one says, how can one start a PR application and join the immigration pool?
Okay, so you will be starting from the express entry system, which is just something you can Google and see Express Entry System Canada. It would come up. You create a profile, but the profile, the express entry profile, has a 1 year validity period. It has a 1 year life. And so after 1 year, it expires, but there's no limits to how many times you can create the express entry profile. At any one time, you want to have just one profile, right? You or your spouse can actually have individual profiles where one person is the principal applicant and they make the other person a dependent, right? Just as a strategy, because maybe a couple would have in two different professions, right? One is in a STEM profession, maybe they are an engineer, and then the other spouse is in healthcare, maybe a doctor or a nurse. And then you want to create two separate express entry profiles, because at any point, if there's a draw for category based, and that category based draw is for STEM professionals, the one of the spouses has a chance to be called. If there's a category draw and for healthcare professionals, the other spouse has a chance to be called. So that's a strategy in itself, right? But where you want to start from is start to gather the documents that you need. The IELTS test, you want to register for the general test, and aim to score 8 in listening, 8 in speaking, 7 in reading, 7 in writing. If you get above these numbers I mentioned, that's nice, because the higher you go, the more points you get. For IELTS, the highest score is 9. So if you get a 9 all around, that would be great. Um, and so once you get that, you want to start your ECA, which is the Educational Credential Assessment. And how you can do that is you, based on what profession you are, you can check to see which of the evaluation bodies you want to make use of. A lot of people make use of WES, World Education Services, to do their evaluation. And then you would have to go to your school or ask your school to send your transcript directly to WES. This is after you've created a profile on WES, for example. I'm using WES as an example. And so once your evaluation is completed and WES sends you that evaluation document, you can create your profile, right? Once you create your profile, you are assigned points. And make sure that any job or work experience that you're claiming on your profile can be supported with an employer reference letter, right? Because that's something that you're going to provide. If you have pay stubs to show, to prove that you actually worked in that job, that would even be better. That would be great also, in addition to your employer reference letter. So only claim jobs that you can support. Okay. And so once you create your profile, you'll be placed in that pool, depending on if you fall under any of those 6 categories which I mentioned: healthcare, trade, transport, agriculture, STEM, or French language skills. If you have any of this, you will have a two-edged sword, because you're under the general pool and you're also under the category based. So that whenever the draw is done, if your score falls within that CRS that is called at the time of that draw, you'll be invited to apply. Okay. And once you're invited to apply for permanent residence, you have 60 days to submit your complete application along with your proof of funds for your family size.
Mm, interesting. Thank you for that. So that leads us to the last question from our guests for today, from our audience for today. So we have someone saying, David Oinaya says, for someone already in the UK and wants to migrate to Canada, what will be the requirements, advice, and immigration route he or she can use to get a PR in Canada? So I'll take that question again. He says, for someone already in the UK and wants to migrate to Canada, what will be the requirements, advice, and immigration route he or she can use to get a PR in Canada?
Yeah, so it would be the same route that I already mentioned for someone who is going to come from Nigeria also. Either you apply directly through Express Entry for PR, or you get a study, come through the study route. And for the study route, I advise these days, since the changes that happened this year, to apply for a master's program, because a master's program is going to give you a 3 year work permit, even if it's a 1 year master's program, right? So it's the same route for someone who is coming from the UK, um, to apply for permanent residence to Canada. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. So at this point, we have actually come to the end of our session for today. A very, very big thank you to Ivy Anigbgu of Anibeth Immigration Canada. We can't thank you enough. Words are not enough to express gratitude to for this great job that you've done in demystifying the mysteries of the Canadian immigration process today. And of course, thank you very much to our audience for joining in live. And I hope when this is uploaded on our various streaming platforms, people who did not join in would also benefit from this. Oh, we have one last comment from the audience. This was very informative. Thank you. So I think I have to display that for Ivy to see.
Thank
This is
you.
very
Thank you. Thank
informative.
you very much. And just before we go, I just wanted to quickly touch on the refugee pathway and refugee route, because I find this is also a misconception that people have about coming to Canada as a visitor and then overstaying your visa with the intention of applying to claim asylum. Um, it's there's a more there's a lot of um, there's a lot of there's a lot that is entailed for a refugee claim to be successful, and I've seen in many instances where this has dashed the hope of people. Like, people's hope have been dashed, because they came with this expectation, and then it's not what they expected. It's a very challenging process to have a refugee claim successful, especially when you're coming from a country like Nigeria. It's challenging. It's more challenging than you think. If you know of people who have gone through and are Nigerians, they've been very lucky to pull through. It's very challenging. And the reason is because there's different factors that are used to determine if a person is actually a refugee. The summary of the definition would be someone who can prove that they've undergone cruel and unusual punishment, somebody who has been oppressed because of their age, because of their social affiliations, because of their gender, someone who has been oppressed, you know. And not just that, you have to also show that you don't have an internal flight alternative, an IFA. So what that means is if somebody is persecuted in a state in Nigeria, for example, and there's another state in Nigeria where they can run to seek refuge in Nigeria, but they haven't done that, that application will be denied, right? And we all know that Nigeria has states that are safe, right? So you have to prove that the government was of no help to protect you. You have to prove that there were non-state actors that were after your life. The proof is like there's a lot, right? So you don't even want to go through that route. I would advise people all the time to go through the proper route, so that you can have peace of mind when you're doing these things. And it's immigration is a major decision. It's not what you just wake up and decide that you want to do it. People plan this process for years before they finally make the decision to travel or to change their environment. So it's not a hasty decision. And also, try not to compare where you are with someone else because you don't even know the full situation. Social media is a huge distraction, is how I like to define it. Because you see a lot of things on there and then you just feel like, oh my gosh, I'm lagging behind in my life. But that might not be the truth. You might even be doing better than that person you're seeing on social media. You don't know that. So if you ever think that you want to immigrate, it has to be a conviction that you have on your own. It shouldn't be driven by someone else that has an appearance of success. Because it might be an appearance, it might not be actually what the situation is, right? It has to be a conviction. There's a lot of challenges on the road, but you want to be convicted before you take that step.
So somebody was saying something like people who look successful on social media, they are not necessarily doing better than you. They only know how to take better pictures than you. So I'm going to display this appreciation comment from David Oyinaya. He says, very insightful. Okay, when you were talking about the refugee, lest I forget, like there was some Nigerian person that came to my mind. Can Bobrisky apply for refugee program?
Oh, yes. Yes, actually.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
where you said the person must have gone through some sort of
Yes.
persecution or something like
Yes.
that, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so
Yes.
Bobrisky can. So I think would send this video to him. Let's see. Sorry. I'm sorry if I'm using the wrong pronouns, right? They can apply. So whatever he identifies as, so
Yeah.
they should apply. Can we rewatch this video later? Yes, you can. It will be available immediately after this session, on the live section of our YouTube channel, and I will also upload it immediately to the podcast streaming platforms. It will be available on Spotify within the hour. Yeah, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, within an hour of the end of this broadcast. Wow, interesting. So our viewers are even responding to that comment already, stating, yes, you can watch it later. You can stream on all platforms. So thank you very much, everybody, once again. And before we leave, I think there is a Nigerian that has done something really spectacular in New York. That is Tunde Onokoya. He broke the Guinness Book of Record for chess marathon. That is the longest, period of time playing chess matches
Wow.
without losing at the New York Square. Yes, Tunde Onokoya. So congratulations to him. Keep the Nigerian flag flying high. Congratulations
Yes.
to everybody who is keeping the Nigerian flag flying high. You see that? So, thank you everybody for joining in. Oh, for the benefit of those people who would be joining on audio only platforms, it says they will accept Bobrisky at once. At once. Congratulations today. Congratulations, Nigerians. I am proudly a Nigerian. So, from me to our audiences, goodbye. God bless you. Any last words from you, Ivy, to members of audience?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, if you want to get in touch with us, and I know you see on the screen now our website, we have an assessment form that you can fill on that website. Once you fill that form, it comes to us directly by email, and then we're able to schedule an appointment. And also, please know that the time that is on that form is Eastern Standard Time, Canada time. So if you can please do the conversion to GMT or to any other time zone that you're on when you're selecting the time, because the time that is there is Canadian Eastern time. So for example, if you select 3 o'clock, that would be 3 o'clock my time in Canada, and then your time if you're in Nigeria would be 8 p.m. Nigerian time. So please have that at the back of your mind. And we're actually running a discount promo at this time now. We've slashed our consultation fee by half. So if you wanted to share our information with people, we're here to work along the way with you. and to, help you through this journey. And we pride ourselves on providing services with integrity and honesty. And so if you reach out to us and you don't have a chance, or you don't have enough of the requirements to meet a particular program, we straight up front tell you you're not able to meet this program. You need to do this, this, and this before you apply. We want to make sure that we're following you through that process to accomplish that dream that you're on. And just one final word: please stay true to yourself. It's so important that you stay true to yourself and that you measure your success based on the level where you are, because everybody has different levels in life, that we all get to. It's a journey in life. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon. So stay on the path where you are, and God will see you through.
Thank you very much once again. Just you just reminded me of some, would I say, skit I saw on social media when he said, if they don't have a chance, if they don't stand a chance, you let them know. I don't know if you ever saw that skit where there was a guy who was juggling a football, and then there was this, big man who came around and was like, "You don't have future here. You don't have future here. You're supposed to
No.
be a dinner man. You're breathing heavily.
Oh my
You're
gosh.
supposed to be serving dinner to the students." Wow. So we end this one on, a funny note. Thank you very much once again, everybody. We have hit the 1 hour, 31-minute mark. Cheers. Have a lovely weekend. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for having me.